What are the pros and cons to using analog hardware? Let's start with the pros. Now, the pros are that you do achieve a better sound from analog hardware, and that is kind of facts. And there is a sonic characteristic of analog hardware that you just don't get in the digital world. When it comes to mastering, the difference between, like, I know personally myself, I can master something digitally, I can master something analog. The difference is night and day. The digital sounds quite dull, quite brittle, quite kind of lifeless in comparison. There's no real depth and 3D image, whereas the analog master does sound so much more exceptionally better. And I know this. I've tested this. I've done digital master, and then I've done an analog master, and I've compared the two, and it's like, whoa, you know, you can't even compare these. The other thing is, with analog mastering, and this is with analog equipment, and one of the major pros of using it is that when you get hands on with a piece of equipment, you work in a bit more of an intuitive way than when you're working with a mouse and a keyboard. It's not, you know, I use a Avid S4 behind me, so I get a full control of plugins, which does alleviate this sort of what I'm talking about here. But when you actually get onto a physical product, you do work with it in a way that is very different to if you was to work with a mouse and keyboard. You feel the resistance of certain parameters. You can really you can work with the EQ or the compressor, whatever it is you're using. You work with the hardware, and you do work in a better way. You do make the right decisions, and you make different decisions to what you would make if you were using a mouse and a keyboard, for instance. And I know that myself, because that's something that I've experienced myself, and I know this for fact. The other thing to mention with analog hardware is, when you're working with hardware, is you can use two hands. So you are jumping around that piece of hardware, changing certain settings, really on the fly. Whereas when you're working with a mouse, for instance, and you're working with digital plugins, you don't necessarily jump around so much. It's very much like that parameter, then that one, then that one. You haven't got two mouse to move different knobs independently of each other. So there is that aspect that is a massive pro to the hardware, because you get on this piece of hardware and you really dart around it. And one thing I will say is, when you're working with hardware, you get to the end result far quicker than if you're working with the digital plugin. For instance, if we set this whole mastering chain up, you see on the left and right of me here, if we set that up as a digital emulation, all digital, and we was to use a mouse, for instance, a master could take us maybe an hour and a half to achieve, because they just for the simple fact of the slowness that it takes to get to the end result, to get to the sound that you actually want. Whereas when you're working on analog, you're so much faster. Like working on this EQ here, you are literally just you fly through it, and you make very instant decisions because you are so hands-on with the hardware, and that does make a big difference. And especially from a service point of view, is that, let's say for argument's sake, if we was working all digital, we could get to the end result of an okay sounding master in a digital world in, let's say, an hour, for argument's sake. Whereas in the analog world, we could reach that end result that we feel is superior to the digital master within half an hour, because we're so much faster working with it. And from a service point of view, if we can achieve a better result faster, by using analog, then it's worth its weight in gold. That's why I use the Avid S4 behind me, because that when I'm mixing, the I don't want to work with analog equipment when mixing, and I'll go into that when I look at all the cons of analog equipment. But using an Avid S4, which is basically a digital controller, I can really get all the hands-on ability that I get with hardware. So this becomes a piece of hardware that makes plugins feel like hardware. With all it's very accurate in the way that it can map. I can map everything exactly like I'm literally got all those pots in front of me. So let's say that's they are the pros to working with analog hardware. Now, the main pro is it's got an exceptional sound quality compared to digital. Now, if we look at the cons for analog hardware, the major thing is recallability. Now, I always say that if you are going to be recalling something and you want to recall, let's say, a mix, if you're recalling a mix, and this is why I don't work with analog whilst mixing, because if you're recalling that mix, and you with a mix, you will have to recall that session multiple times, because mixes are very subjective, and there are things that will need to change. Mastering, not so much, because mastering is right. It goes through. You do the master, the end master sounds brilliant, and it 99% of the time is signed off there and then. You don't need to recall it that much. Mixing, on the other hand, there's a bit of to and fro, because of the fact that mixing is very much subjective, and you have to achieve some, especially when you're working in a service like mine, where you have to achieve a sound that's what the client wants, and also what you feel is correct and what you want. So there is a little bit of back and forwards. And believe me, I used to have a modular kind of SSL console, and it was massively a pain to set everything back up exactly as it was every single time. You would never, ever, ever get it identical. So every time you loaded that session up to do an edit to the mix, it would always change. Every time it would change, just slightly. It would, and it would take you the best part of 15 minutes to set a mix up. Now imagine if you've got to do 4 edits, and each time those edits take 15 minutes just to set up. That's an hour out of your day just for setting up an analog console. So, and for me personally, like, the issue is with analog, for me, and this is the reason why I went to an Avid S4. The thing with it is you can only sum in stereo with a stereo summing console. So we can only get a stereo sum. But I want to work with multi-channel. I want to work in Dolby Atmos, and when comparing Dolby Atmos to stereo, even analog summing, it's far better, because you get the Dolby Atmos binaural into that. So it's you do get, and for me, I'm always about that, getting that better sound, getting that edge over anyone else by having something that creates just an exceptional sound, without my actual physical knowledge having to have a factor in it. If I can implement something, let's say I can get a really good EQ that just instantly sounds better, regardless of who's using it, it instantly sounds better, then that is something that I'm going to get. So what I'm saying here is in terms of the recallability, it didn't outweigh having to do all this analog summing and having analog EQs and everything. The fact that it took me, let's say, an hour to do recalls over a session of 4 edits, didn't outweigh the sound quality that I was getting. Now when we work in Dolby Atmos, we can achieve that better sound than when we're summing. So it's brilliant. It's a good way to kind of progress from analog summing into digital summing and working on a digital desk. But the main con that I'm talking about here is that recallability. Now, when you're working in the digital world, we all know you open a session, it opens up, and away you go. You're exactly where you left off. When you're working with analog, you have to sit there and dial everything in, and you cannot dial it in bang on every time. It doesn't. It just doesn't. It no matter how accurate you try and be, you will at some point be slightly off. Kind of different when it's working in mastering, because the thing with mastering is the majority of the mastering equipment is stepped parameters, so you can bang on step those bang on, whereas SSL, for instance, the pots are kind of rotary, not rotary, but they're not stepped, so pulling them back to exactly where they were is very, very difficult. Now, this is from the perspective of someone that's working with an online mixing service where, you know, I could be working with 5-6 different people each day. So I have to jump between sessions. And if I had to do that all on an analog desk, I would have to put my prices right up, because it would take me far more time to do, and they wouldn't achieve a better sound for doing that. So they would have to pay more to not achieve anything better. So for me, this is the better option for me. Now I like to work. Any production. I like to work in the box. Keep everything in the box. Anything where I'm recalling all the time, I like to keep it in the box. So any production, I like to keep all that in the box. Any mixing, I like to also keep that all in the box, mixing Dolby Atmos. Any mastering, I come out the box. And the reason I say that is because, like I said before, is when it comes to mastering, there's very little in the way that you need to come back and recall. And even if you did have to change the mix, for instance, the master has to change anyway. So let's start the master from the beginning, or even let's recall it to as close as we can get, and then we'll tweak off of that. So it doesn't really matter. Now, one thing to mention as a con is plugins like, let's say, Soothe, for instance, or plugins like Golfos. These sorts of plugins that rely on digital processing, because there's a reason there's no analog version of like Soothe. Like, there are de-essers and kind of tools like that, but there's nothing that works in the same way as Soothe does, or nothing that I'm aware of. And if I was aware of it, I would have it. So there's nothing that works in the same way Soothe does. So when it comes to digital, some plugins are actually better than what you can get in the analog world. So when it comes to like something like mastering, it's not a case of one or the other. It's a case of using the both. You know, like I have Soothe before I hit the analog chain, and then I have Soothe again when I come back in, because I want to use Soothe before it goes out, soothe any transient, soothe any harsh frequencies before going out into the analog chain. Then when I come back in, I want to soothe anything that's comes back in. So anything that's been added, any kind of if any resonance or any kind of harsh frequencies have been added whilst mastering, I want to soothe that once I go back into the box. Now, another con to mention is cost. Analog equipment costs a lot. It really does cost a lot. And if you do plan on going out the box and starting to work in the analog world, be prepared to spend. You want to be spending, if you want a really good mastering chain, you're going to want to be spending £10,000 upwards. 10 to 30,000 will get you a good mastering chain. There's a massive cost involved. If you're talking in the mixing world, you know, you've got to buy multiple instances of analog hardware to create your chains that you're going to be wanting to use when mixing. And that's expensive. It's very, very expensive, and it does it doesn't go far, because let's say you want to set up, I don't know, 16 channels. You're probably talking about, for a decent channel strips, an EQ and compressor, you're probably talking minimum 1,500 to $2,000 per channel strip. And if you've got 16 of them, what's that, 32 at $2,000 a pop? You're talking 32 grand. So there's a massive amount of money that going into the analog world is going to cost. And if you're, what I always say when I talk about kind of cost in the analog world is that if you're not going to go big, don't even bother. If you're not going to spend a lot of money on good quality equipment, if you're going to buy cheap, stay in the box. If the digital emulations of real good quality equipment is really good, and it's maybe, let's say it's 95% there. But if you were spending £500, on a mastering EQ, for instance, you're better off using an emulation of like the AMEC EQ or something like that, in the box, because you're going to get a better sound. Because like that £500 piece of hardware isn't going to be exceptional, but the plugin is. And there's a massive cost difference here when you look at plugins. On Plugin Alliance you can pick up plugins for $29. That's the going rate for quality plugins now that Plugin Alliance have done what they've kind of done. That is the going rate. That's how much people are spending on quality plugins. Hardware, on the other hand, a good quality EQ, you're talking $4,000, for instance. You can talk a $7,000 for a Maselec MEA2, or that $7,000 is for a certain person. That's someone who is doing this for a living, because the average person who's doing it for, let's say, fun, they're not going to spend $7,000. And there's no harm in not spending $7,000. You can spend $29 on a plugin, and get a really good sound, and you really can get a good sound. So that is the pros and cons to analog hardware. Now for me personally, as I said before, I would personally produce in the box, mix in the box, master out the box, and that's the way that I love to do things, because it's all about recall for me.